Yeah, it's pretty amazing what guys
So
can get out of those motors even on a stock block with a turbo or supercharger or whatever you want. And naturally aspirated, there's really nothing in the league of a K24 for power production. I mean,
now if you are looking to get a car or this engine, get it now because it's super cheap. You can probably find them in the junkyard real easy, and they have a huge aftermarket support. Not only that, these are very reliable engines.
The K-motor is one of my favorite engines because it has a huge amount of aftermarket support. The cylinder head flows like no other, and it can make a tremendous amount of horsepower in boosted or naturally aspirated applications.
You look inside, it's neat, it's clean, it's got oil squirters on the bottom of the pistons. As a performance enthusiast, this is kind of what you would expect an engine to look like inside.
In 2001, Honda replaced the venerable B-Series family of inline fours with an all-new engine family dubbed the K-Series. This new engine family featured an aluminum block with cast iron sleeves, a coil-on-plug ignition system, and only 2 options for displacement compared to the 5 of the previous generation. And of course, the K-Series engine features the cylinder head wizardry that Honda had become famous for. With production lasting over 20 years, this engine has made a name for itself by simultaneously offering giggle-inducing performance while having a long-term relationship with reliability. Whether if they knew it or not, the engineers at Honda had not developed an economy car engine, but instead had created an engine that would forever change the car community.
The Honda K-Series was primarily designed to be the workhorse of Honda's lineup. So while there are high-performance versions of the K-motors, most of the ones that you're going to find are just basically engines that were designed to get you from point A to point B. Because of that design directive, when you look at the K-Series spec sheet, at first glance it might not seem overly impressive. The Honda K, much like the Chevy LS, isn't just one motor, it's actually a family of engines. And while there are 3 different displacements for the K-Series, there's actually only 2 different blocks. These 2 different blocks share the same design, and the only difference between them is their deck height. The K20 has a deck height of 8.3 inches, and the K23 and 24 have a deck height of 9.1 inches. From those 2 different blocks, Honda created over 40 different variants of the K-Series. So if I was going to sit here and go over every difference in between them, we'd be here for 40 days and 40 nights. So I'm going to give you kind of a spark notes or a highlight reel of the K-Series. The first thing to take note of is that the K20 has a square stroke ratio, which means that its bore and stroke are equal. The K24, on the other hand, is an undersquare engine, which means it has a larger stroke volume than it has a bore diameter. So what does that mean in the real world? Because of the differences of stroke ratio, the K20 is capable of revving higher. So if you're somebody like me who loves high RPM engines, the K20 is probably the K-Series that you want to target. But the K24, on the other hand, is probably the motor that most people will go after. As people typically say, there's no replacement for displacement. And the K24 has 20% more displacement, mostly due to having a longer stroke volume. But if you do want to go after high RPM in the K24, things are going to be a lot harder and more expensive to achieve the same RPM levels that you could get out of a K20. When you look at the offerings for the K-Series lineup, you probably have noticed that most of the options are naturally aspirated. But there are a few notable exceptions. Honda did offer turbocharging on a few models, most notably on the K20C found in the Civic Type R and a few other Hondas, and also the motor in the Acura RDX, which is the K23.
Not if I have anything to say about it, and I do.
Alright, so I'm kind of in the middle of editing this video, and I realize that a lot of what I'm talking about only really applies to the naturally aspirated K-motors. So I kind of wanted to take a second to talk about the 2 turbocharged options because they are quite different from the other K-Series. So I kind of just wanted to make sure that everybody really understood the different options that were available with the K-Series. The first factory turbocharged K-Series was the K23, which was found in the Acura RDX from 2007 to 2012. The K23A1 has a number of differences from the other K-Series, and you kind of need to be aware of these if you are looking for a K-Series for yourself. So starting up top, the valve cover is different. That's because the RDX had a top mount intercooler kind of like a Subaru WRX, and because of that the valve cover has mounting provisions for the intercooler. Since the intake path is actually over the top of the engine, the intake manifold faces upward instead of downward like it typically does on a K-Series. The exhaust manifold is more of a collector rather than a traditional header. The exhaust manifold is also water-cooled, and the entire cylinder head casting is actually different from every other K-Series motor too. And that's because the cylinder head actually has provisions for the water-cooled exhaust manifold. The bottom end of the K23 is also quite a bit different as well. The K23's block is based off of the K24's block, so it has the taller deck and longer stroke, but it has the smaller bore of the K20. So because of that, the K23 has a slightly smaller displacement than the K24. Honda also lowered the compression ratio to 8.8 to make the engine more boost friendly. And when looking at accessories like the oil pan, water pump, alternator, stuff like that, there's lots of parts that are specific only to the RDX, but a lot of them interchange with other K-Series. A big point to keep in mind is that the K23 actually shares a bell housing pattern with the J-Series and not with the other K-Series engines. And why that's important is if you are looking to swap a K-Series, a K23 is not going to bolt up to the transmissions or gearbox adapters designed for the K20 or the K24. So unless you are specifically looking for a first-gen Acura RDX, the K23 probably isn't the engine for you. But I still think it's worth noting that you can actually swap the entire top end of a K23 onto a K20. So that means you can swap the head, exhaust manifold, turbo, all that stuff, and then put it on a K20 and basically make a poor man's version of the K20C. So if you're like me and these types of cracktivities sound like something you're interested in and possibly even a future project, check out VTEC Academy's channel. They've done this swap and they actually have an entire video where they completely disassembled a K23. The other factory turbocharged option for the K-Series was the K20C. So while this engine is technically a K20, you could really make the argument that it's actually a completely different engine. When looking at the differences between a K20A and a K20C, obviously the first one that you're going to notice is that the K20C is turbocharged. But the cylinder head is also very different. The K20C has switched to direct injection. The intake ports have half the flow of the regular K-Series because they are designed to tumble the air into the cylinder, and that's absolutely essential if you're making a direct injection motor. The K20C has VTEC valve lift only on its exhaust cam, and variable valve timing on both the intake and exhaust cams. And the exhaust manifold is water-cooled just like the K23's, but Honda went one step further, and the exhaust manifold is actually integrated into the casting for the cylinder head. The block also has additional passages for cooling the oiling system, and the crankshaft is offset by 8mm from the center line. There are two main versions of the K20C, the K20C1 and the K20C4. Now, if you were to get on Wikipedia, you would notice that there are a lot of other engine codes for the K20C, but once you start to explore as to why all these engines have different codes, the primary differences are mounting locations for the different vehicles that Honda put these engines into. Pretty much all of the Honda K20Cs are either based off of the K20C1 or the K20C4. The K20C1 is used in the Honda Civic Type R and the Acura Integra Type-S. And the K20C4 is used in the Accord, RDX, and TLX. So I've actually had a lot of Accord owners tell me that the Accord has the same exact engine as the Type R, and the only differences are in the ECU, and Honda just effectively nerfed the C4. But actually that's not entirely true. The C1 does have different tuning, but once you start to look into the two different engines, you'll notice that the Type R's engine actually has different hardware as well. The Type R or the K20C1 has a better fuel system, bigger turbo, different camshafts, higher compression pistons, and does not have balance shafts. So at the end of the day, the Type R and the Accord engines are based on the same architecture, but there are many differences that affect performance, so I don't really think it's fair to call them the same exact engine.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
And then the last piece of technology that I want to point out on the K-Series is probably the thing that Honda is most famous for. If you are a car enthusiast and you know Honda, you know the name VTEC. The K-Series has what's called i-VTEC. Basically, the best way to think about it is that i-VTEC is the traditional valveless system that you probably think about when you think about that Honda that's revving outside your house at 3 a.m. But Honda went and combined the valve lift system with a variable valve timing system that's similar to BMW's Vanos. Now, in terms of if VTEC works on the intake or the exhaust or on both cams, it's highly dependent on which model or engine you have, and I should say more effectively which cylinder head you have. But regardless of which K-Series motor you have, you can rest easy knowing that these things are stupid reliable. The K-Series doesn't really have that many common problems. Issues that you might experience with the K-Series include failure of the timing chain tensioners, oil leaks, and premature wear of the exhaust camshaft. And while failure of the timing chain tensioner sounds kinda scary to me as a Volkswagen owner, it's not uncommon for these engines that have their routine maintenance done to live for up to 200,000 or 300,000 miles. Like I said before, the K-Series was designed to be the everyday workhorse of Honda's lineup, and so it's not really surprising that a whole lot of engineering and time was spent trying to make this engine reliable. And it's also not surprising that Honda then went and put this engine in literally everything. And no, seriously, I mean everything. It is super easy to find a Honda K motor. In fact, when I went looking for the LS for my E34 swap, I tripped over a K24 in the junkyard. It is not hard to find one of these engines, like, at all. But since the K-Series had more than 40 different variants, it may be difficult to find the exact spec of engine that you're looking for. But that's not really a problem, because the K-Series is the successor to one of the greatest four-cylinders of all time, the Honda B-Series. And just like its predecessor, the Honda K-Series is a legend in the car community for its aftermarket and tuning potential. If there was a Hall of Fame for tuner engines, the Honda K-Series is first ballot hands down, right next to engines like the LS and the 2JZ. Whatever you are into, there's a K-Series modification for you. You like high RPM? The K-Series can do that. You like boost? The K-Series can do that. You like the boost but you want the K-Series can do that. But wait, you said that you like rear-wheel drive cars? Well, unfortunately, I have to tell you that you're out of luck because the K-Series with
Psych!
the K-Series can do that too. And then after you've spent way too much time looking at the aftermarket options for this engine and finally have settled on what you want to do to your engine, the Honda K-Series is extremely responsive to tuning. It's possible to get up to 300 horsepower from the K-Series naturally aspirated. Let's just let that sink in for a second. I know TikTok car culture has everybody thinking 300 horsepower is slow, but in the real world, 300 horsepower is more than enough to have a good time. And then on top of that, let's just think about that. If you're getting 300 horsepower out of a K24, that's a 2.4 liter. That means you're getting 125 horsepower per liter. Like, what the devil? That is nearly the same as the LaFerrari. That is absolutely bananas. And the K-Series isn't just a one-hit wonder that's great at naturally aspirated performance. If you're interested in forced induction, the K-Series can offer nearly 500 horsepower on stock internals. But since the K-Series aftermarket is so incredibly robust, that's just the beginning. Once you start to dip your toes into the aftermarket for engine internals, the sky is the limit, or I should say more effectively, your wallet is the limit. And it's actually pretty easy to get this motor tuned, regardless of if you have a car that came with one from the factory, or if you're doing a swap. Thanks to companies like Honda, the stock ECU is able to handle pretty much anything you want to throw at it. Boost control, flex fuel, data logging, it doesn't matter. The stock ECU can be reflashed to suit your build's needs. Now, while the stock ECU can pretty much handle all of these things, it can be a little bit more of a headache to get the tune dialed in just perfectly if you have more extreme modifications on your engines like ITBs or real race car parts. If that's your situation, you can upgrade to a standalone ECU from a company like i-VTEC or Link. Both of these companies offer plug-and-play solutions for the K motors. Or you can just go grab a universal ECU from a company like FuelTech or really any other company. Because unlike the N54 from the last episode of Power Rankings, most K24s that car enthusiasts are going to go after do not feature direct injection. So you can pretty much adapt any standalone ECU to the K-Series. Because of all of this aftermarket potential, the K-Series is quickly becoming one of the most dominant engines in the modding scene. And that's partially because those people who are developing the aftermarket are outside of their minds. And it's partially related to the fact that this engine provides an enormous amount of value. You would think that with all that the K-Series has to offer, it's going to be really expensive to get one of these fabulous engines. But that's not actually the case. I was talking to one of my friends about the K-Series and the 5.3 LS, and I was telling him that I think it's kind of odd how even though these engines are really in demand, the prices stay low. And after talking about it for a while, our theory on why this is the case kind of comes down to the Honda K-Series' incredible reliability. What seems to be the case with the K-Series is due to its phenomenal reliability record, outside of the car community, there's not really a demand for these engines. Because, well, it's incredibly rare that something happens to these motors that necessitates a full engine replacement. And then add in on top of that the K-Series has been in production for almost over 20 years at this point. So there are a huge supply of K-powered cars in the junkyard for non-engine related problems. Most of the time they're usually there due to some type of accident or collision. So that kind of creates a situation where the supply far exceeds the demand, and that makes these engines actually super cheap. If you want to get into the K-Series game, you can probably get an engine from your local junkyard for as little as $600. I don't know what else to say. Like, I don't. It's just wild to me that this much performance is available for this amount of money. And then when it comes to mods and looking for a horsepower to dollar return on investment, unlike most naturally aspirated engines, the K-Series offers immense value. You can easily find a turbo kit for a K-Series and add up to 200 horsepower for under $1,500. So where does the Honda K-Series rank on my is it worth it scale? The K-Series is hands down one of the greatest things to ever happen to the car community. In stock form, these motors might not seem all that special when you look at the spec sheet. And for those who are unfamiliar with Honda's game, when you look at the K-Series, it looks just like an incredibly reliable 4 Series with anemic power levels. But for those of us who know, the K-Series is a titan. You'd be hard pressed to find another engine outside of, I don't know, maybe the LS, that is as versatile as the K-Series. Regardless of if you turbocharge this engine, supercharge it, or go for a high RPM naturally aspirated build, this engine is a force to be reckoned with. And since I can see my audience demographics, I know most of the people who watch this channel are older car enthusiasts. In fact, a lot of you guys are over 55. So I'm sure there's going to be one or two crusty dudes down in the comments talking about how the K-Series isn't a real engine because it's too small and it doesn't have enough displacement and all these other things, right? But all I have to say to people who are making that claim is to just sit down and take a hard, honest look at what the K-Series offers you as a performance car enthusiast. Because once you start to understand what Honda has done here, you'll realize that just like the LS, the K-Series is one of the greatest engines ever available to your average car enthusiast.